Okay, Alexander. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of our American Hellenic Institute Virtual Speakers Forum. My name is Nick Larigakis, president of the American Hellenic Institute, and today, as always, we come live to you from our AHI headquarters in Washington, D.C. Hellenic House. On behalf of AHI, our nonprofit independent Greek-American Public Policy Center, it is my pleasure to present our virtual speakers forum to commemorate the 83rd anniversary of OXI Day. Today, we pay tribute to the legacy OXI Day left on the outcome of World War II. In 1940, with Europe under the heel of Nazi Germany, and with Britain fighting the Axis powers alone, Greece's reply on October 28, 1940 of OXI to Mussolini's surrender ultimatum gave hope to the forces of freedom. Greece, vastly outnumbered, ultimately defeated the Italian army and pushed them into the mountains of Albania. This defeat of Mussolini resulted in the first defeat of the Axis in World War II. Although Greece eventually succumbed to the Nazi war machine, it did not occur without a valiant effort that included a brave stand at the Battle of Crete, which caused Hitler to delay his invasion of Russia and arguably changed the outcome of the war. Even today, we still see Greece's own resiliency come to the forefront as it endures countless issues on multiple fronts. And the resiliency Greece displayed during World War II is in full display today in Ukraine. Certainly, a comparison can be drawn between Greece's defiance of fascism to Ukraine's brave stand to stave off Russia's invading forces under the direction of a notorious dictator in Mr. Putin. And the state of Israel, in the wake of an unprecedented, heinous terrorist attack and assault on her people by Hamas, the worst atrocity committed against Jews since the Holocaust, will never submit to the evils of terrorism, extremism, and hatred. Indeed, the legacy of OXI Day remains. The unequivocal and unwavering message of defiance made on that day 83 years ago is needed now and arguably more than ever since 1940. To help us take a deeper dive into OXI Day's significance as we commemorate this special day in Greek history, I am pleased to present our distinguished speaker, Dr. Hadjivasiliou, who is with us here today. Allow me a few words regarding his background. Dr. Evanthis Hadjivasiliou is a professor of post-war history at the Department of History and Archaeology at the University of Athens and serves as the Secretary General of the Hellenic Parliament Foundation for Parliamentarism and Democracy. He graduated from the Law School of Aristotle University Thessaloniki and received his MA and PhD in International History from the London School of Economics. He is an author, a prolific author on various journals, articles, and publications, including Greece and the Cold War, Frontline State, 1952 to 67, and the NATO Committee on the Challenges of Modern Society, 1969 to 1975. Today, his topic to commemorate OXI Day will be on Choosing International Legality, Greece's Road to World War II. It is a great pleasure to have you with us here today, Professor Hadjivasiliou. First time for you to present at an American Hellenic Institute event. It's a great honor us to have you here. And I give you the Zoom floor for your presentation, which we look forward to. And I do remind our audience that to use your Q&A function at the bottom of your screens to submit any questions you might have that we will present to Professor Hadjivasiliou, time being, of course, if we have time availability at today's presentation. So again, Professor, welcome.
Thank you so much, Mr. President, and many thanks for this enormous honor that you did to me by inviting me to present today. Ladies and gentlemen, war in modern history has been a multifaceted phenomenon that tests the coherence of society as well as the identity and the perseverance of the individual. After the Industrial Revolution, however, war became a much more organized affair in which individuals often are crushed. According to the prevailing view today, for example, expressed by the late Christopher Cocker, a prominent expert of international relations, In Western culture of the 20th century, glory and the epic element no longer appear in perceptions of war. They have been annihilated in the industrial slaughter of trench warfare in 1914 to 1918 during the First World War. There is little heroic in contemporary warfare, most scholars say. There's much in this view. The depiction of modern war in terms of glory and epos are rather rare in our days, but one of the exceptions is the case of the Greeks in 1940 to 41. At that time, their struggle, the struggle of Greece, was hailed by allies and neutrals alike, including the then neutral United States, as a triumph of a small nation against the forces of barbarism. Today, I will discuss Greece's road to the war, Greece's decision regarding the war. I will argue that in Greece's decision to fight were incorporated pivotal elements of the system of international legitimacy to which Greece felt attached, and which it strove to defend even in that very dark hour of world history. Greece's war derived from and expressed an existential choice in favor of international legality. Our story starts in the aftermath of the First World War, which brought about huge changes in perceptions and policies, the loss of millions of people in trench warfare, the bankruptcy of all, victors and vanquished, with the only exceptions of the United States and Japan, the collapse of the old empires, Russia, Austria-Hungary, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire. All these were gigantic phenomena that sparked major changes on many levels, geopolitical, economic, and ideological. The years after the Great War was an era of great challenges and noble hopes. The war to end all wars had now been terminated, and the autocratic regimes had vanished. The victors were the democratic forces, Britain, France, and mostly Woodrow Wilson's United States. In the peace conference, thanks to President Wilson, for the very first time in human history, a major step towards the organization of the international society was made with the creation of the League of Nations, the first global organization. In this global organization, all states could participate and could have a say, not only the great powers only, as was the case with the aristocratic European concert of the 19th century. A new era seemed to be coming in which the anarchical international system could finally follow some fundamental principles: international legitimacy, the respect of the treaties and of the borders, and the avoidance of war emerged as some of the main principles of this new international order. Well, if these were the hopes, the challenges were equally big. Pressed by their public opinion, the victors made a fatal mistake. They showed towards Germany an ineffective cruelty. Germany was considered as the sole responsible for the war and had to pay unrealistically high reparations, which would impair its economic reconstruction. In 1919, a young British economist, John Maynard Keynes, warned that if the German economy could not recover, the whole European economy would be unable to do it, and therefore a new war would become possible. However, he was ignored. Anyway, while Germany was humiliated after the First World War on many levels, it still retained the basis of its power, mostly its industrial strength. This meant that when this angry Germany recovered, it would be a dangerous actor in world affairs. The truth of the matter was that the victors tried to set up a liberal international system, but the peace treaties did not create a very stable context. In the new global organization, the League of Nations, important states did not participate: the Soviet Union, the United States, and Germany, namely the two eventual superpowers and the largest European economy. In other words, the League's ideology was charming, but the power that supported it was inadequate. And therefore, soon post-war Europe was divided into camps. On the one hand, there were the so-called conservative forces, the victors of the war, headed mostly by France. These were the countries that accepted the treaties, the existing borders, and the new international legitimacy. On the other hand, there were the so-called revisionist countries, mostly Germany, but also Austria, Hungary, in the Balkans, Bulgaria. Italy, although a victor of the war, was also a revisionist country. Indeed, the dissatisfaction of Rome with the borders, the Italians believed that they had not gained enough territories after the First World War, This dissatisfaction also helped Mussolini in his ascent to power, which took place on the 28th of October 1922. This, therefore, 28th of October was a day of celebration, the anniversary of the Italian fascist regime, and it was on this anniversary that Mussolini launched his attack of Greece in the 1940s. Nevertheless, this dispute between conservative and revisionist countries, the countries that accepted and the countries that rejected international legitimacy, the treaties and the established borders, would decide international politics in interwar Europe. Things became worse in 1929 when the Great Depression destabilized the system even further and even helped Hitler's ascent to power. France now entered a period of instability and could not play the role of the guarantor of the system. The revisionist forces were strengthened. Western democracy, with its economic system in shambles, felt that it was a civilization in retreat. But this West still represented international legality. Could it stand against Hitler's revisionism? Well, let's stop here for a moment and check where Greece was in this process. In the early 1920s, the Greek world suffered a devastating blow, the Asia Minor disaster and the expulsion of the Greek populations from Asia Minor and Eastern Thrace. This caused the abandonment of the Megali Idea, and more than that, a huge trauma, social, economic, ideological, and psychological. Deeply wounded, torn by the huge internal political passions of the national schism, facing the social horrors of the refugee experience, Greece now wanted to be left outside the future European war. It had no territorial claims, no longer had any territorial claims, and therefore it could not win anything from a new war, but it had much to lose. It accepted, therefore, the new international system. With the brief parenthesis of the Pangalos dictatorship, 1925 to 26, Greece was a conservative state and wanted to avoid entanglements in power politics. Initially, Greece turned its attention to the much promising League of Nations, but soon it was disappointed from the international organization. In 1923, when an Italian general was assassinated in the Greek-Albanian frontier, Mussolini's Italy bombed and occupied the demilitarized island of Corfu. Greece then appealed to the United Nations, but the international organization simply referred the issue to an ambassadorial conference, and Athens was condemned to pay an indemnity for the murder of the Italian general, the murder for which it had not been proved that Athens was responsible. Then in 1925, when Bulgarian soldiers killed a Greek officer carrying a white flag in the common border, Greece copied Italian behavior. It invaded Bulgaria in a punitive expedition. But now Sofia appealed to the League of Nations and was vindicated. Greece was condemned to pay an indemnity. In other words, Greece was being forced to pay indemnities, both when it was the victim and the culprit of aggression. The message for Athens, therefore, was clear. The League could not be true to its principles if one of the parties of a dispute were a great power. If a great power were involved, other kinds of compromise would be sought by the international system. This meant that the League was useful, but could not replace national power in the pursuit of national interest. But what power could this defeated Greece wield in the 1920s? Well, the answer to this existential dilemma was given, as has happened many times in the past, by Eleftherios Venizelos during his last term in office, 1928 to 32. Venizelos restored normal relations with all great powers of that time, Britain, France, and Italy, and he restored relations with neighboring countries, including Yugoslavia in 1929 and Turkey in 1930. He only failed in the case of Bulgaria because Bulgaria persisted in claiming Greek territories and not recognizing the existing borders. Venizelos put forward a new idea: economic development, which would heal the wounds, and the full integration of Greece in the European international context. That was the plan. For example, Venizelos' Greece was one of the few countries that accepted the French proposal for the setting up of a federal union of Europe in 1929. But once more, the Great Depression after 1929 devastated this planning. Greece's bankruptcy in 1932 destroyed the new prospects, and left the country literally dead in the water in the great international crisis of the European 1930s. And so we come to this, the great international crisis of the 1930s, which effectively started with Hitler's announcement of the rearmament of Germany in 1935. It is not possible to present here a detailed account of these dark days. Let me just point out that the 1930s was an era when revisionism took the upper hand in Europe, and the conservative forces, the advocates of international legitimacy, were facing huge dead ends, both in terms of their power, but also psychologically and intellectually. The Western democracies, the European Western democracies, also through their own mistakes, found themselves in full retreat and suffered unspeakable humiliations. But while throughout Europe the revisionists were being strengthened, Greece sided with international legality. So its entry into the war in October 1940 was the culmination of a policy that involved existential choices, in effect, a choice of worlds. Now, the rise of Hitler was fatal because now the largest and most powerful revisionist force in Europe found itself under a radical revolutionary regime, like the Nazist one. Nazism only had contempt for a dignified behavior, both in internal and in external policy, and pursued the tactics of thugs. Repeatedly, from 1935 to 1939, foreign leaders were threatened, even physically threatened, were humiliated or deceived. Hitler used salami tactics. He always tried to separate his opponents and destroy them one by one. In 1935, he announced the setting up of the Luftwaffe. The Western democracies did not react. In 1936, he remilitarized the Rhineland, directly violating the Treaty of Versailles. France did not move, torn by its own anti-war spirit and its internal political instability, and lacking clear British support. Instead, France decided to retreat behind its defensive Maginot Line, which meant that it felt unable to act energetically in support of the international order. Hitler realized this immediately. In March 1938, Germany annexed Austria. This was a full violation of the treaties, a change of borders, but again, Britain and France did not react. In autumn 1938, the Czechoslovak crisis led to the Munich Conference and the humiliation by Hitler of Britain and France. Appeasement became a dirty word in international vocabulary. Mostly, Hitler became convinced that the degenerate West, as he saw them, would not stop him. In the next crisis, the Polish crisis, he brushed aside his own advisors' call for caution, noting with contempt, quote, "Our enemies are little worms. I saw them in Munich," unquote. Perhaps there was a mistake here on Hitler's part. The Western democracies sincerely wanted peace and hoped that after Munich, Germany would become a saturated power. They failed to see that Hitler's appetite was growing the more he was eating. The destruction of Czechoslovakia in March 1939 was the red line for Britain and France. They decided that they would have to stand firm in the next crisis. The problem now was that Hitler did not believe them. He had seen them in Munich. He now believed that they would always retreat. The Western countries would always retreat. After all, on the 23rd of August 1939, Hitler scored another huge victory with the conclusion of the Nazi-Soviet Pact. This pact removed the danger that he would have to fight on two fronts. It was very short-sighted on the part of Joseph Stalin, but let's face it, neither the leader of Moscow nor the leader of Berlin were supporters of this collapsing liberal international order. And this is how war came after Hitler's invasion of Poland. In other words, by 1939, the revisionist forces had prevailed in Europe, first psychologically, then on the battlefield. This happened also because of the moral weakness of Western democracies. It derived from their own traumatic experience of trench warfare during the Great War, but also from the Great Depression. In the 1930s, the advent of dictatorships throughout Europe seemed to point to the fact that Western democracy represented a civilization in decline. This is how it appeared at that time. In this context, the European countries seemed to be ready to fall to the advancing forces of violence. One country, however, had decided, despite its own great weaknesses, to remain on the path of the international order and the legality, and that country was Greece. Now, the 1930s was for Greece a very difficult time. After bankruptcy in 1932, there was a resurgence of the internal political conflict of the national schism. Several military coups took place in 1933 to 1935, and finally the country succumbed ingloriously to a dictatorship by Ioannis Metaxas. However, let me note that this chaotic picture does not really appear in Greece's foreign relations. The country persisted in its major decisions after the Asia Minor disaster. It followed a conservative, effectively pro-Western policy. This line was followed by successive governments, the Venizelists until 1932, the anti-Venizelists in 1933 to 35, even the Metaxas dictatorship after 1936. Now, in the 1930s, Greece was increasingly siding with the conservative powers, despite the fact that the revisionist ones were being visibly strengthened. The anti-Venizelist government of Panagis Tsaldaris, 1933 to 35, well, it largely followed the line of the previous government of Eleftherios Venizelos. The bilateral rapprochement with Turkey, for example, was expanded through the conclusion of an alliance of the two states aiming to safeguard their common borders in Thrace from revisionist Bulgaria. Greece also participated in the Balkan Pact in 1934, together with Turkey, Yugoslavia, and Romania. It participated in this pact because this offered further assurances against Bulgaria's revisionism. Participation in the Balkan Pact was another turning point in Greece's siding with the conservative powers in Europe. Now, according to contemporary research, the definite choices, the definite decisions of Greece, the ones that would determine its position in this great international crisis of the 30s, were made during the Abyssinian crisis of 1935. This crisis started with Italy's invasion against the African country, then threatened to cause a war between Italy and Britain. The Tsaldaris government decided that Greece should not participate in a new European war. But if this became inevitable, the government decided, Greece would side with Britain, not with Italy. This decision did not derive from a narrow examination of the balance of powers in the region. For example, the Italian Navy, at least on paper, was more powerful than the British Mediterranean fleet. The decision derived from the fact that Greece could not side with revisionism. It would have too much to lose, since it would have to face demands of the revisionist powers in its own neighborhood, therefore Italy and Bulgaria. So late 1935 was the crucial moment of Greece's decision. The Metaxas dictatorship merely continued this policy. It did not shape it. Metaxas himself, as becomes evident from his diary, understood that Greece had to side with the British, who were expected to control the Mediterranean. Moreover, King George II also had strong connections with London. And last but not least, in the 1930s, Greece was the only Eastern European country that was not dominated by German foreign trade, as happened even with Yugoslavia and Romania. The German clearing agreements did absorb large quantities of Greek tobacco, but this was offset by Greece's maritime orientation, which helped the country maintain its links with London and with international markets, and therefore a significant measure of economic independence from Berlin. Metaxas still wanted to keep Greece out of a new European war. This was a natural preference. The country was bankrupt. It faced huge social challenges, including widespread poverty and the need to accommodate the refugees of the Asia Minor disaster. And anyway, Greece had nothing to win from a new war. It had much to lose. But this visible strengthening of the revisionist forces in Europe, mostly the Munich Conference, and the abandonment of Czechoslovakia by the West, these things increasingly led Athens, even under a dictatorship, to a policy in favor of international legality and of the Western democracies. The strengthening of the revisionists simply was too threatening. In 1938, Metaxas even suggested to Britain to form an alliance, but was ignored by Britain. It was rejected. Therefore, Greece did not succumb to a British pressure. On the contrary, Greece itself offered its alliance, which Britain ignored. According to London, Greece was too weak to be accepted as an ally, as an equal. It is telling that in the work of the major expert on the coming of the war, the celebrated British historian Donald Cameron Watt, the, quote, struggle for the Balkans, 1938 to 39, is depicted as the antagonism of Britain and Germany for influencing Yugoslavia and Turkey, the major Balkan countries, and Greece is covered only in a few paragraphs. In 1939, Britain and France offered a unilateral guarantee to Greece, but concluded a treaty of alliance with Turkey. In other words, they treated Greece as a client and Turkey as an equal. However, in the end, Greece was the one that offered the first victory in the land war against totalitarianism, while Turkey, skillfully and to the distress of the British, remained neutral almost until the end of the war. Now, on the last stages of the road to the Italian invasion, it is possible to detect even a tragic dimension in Metaxas's attitudes. Metaxas had spent much of his life fighting Eleftherios Venizelos, but now he implemented essentially the policy of his great opponent, siding with the Western democracies. There was even a degree of soul-searching. For example, there is this much debated diary entry in which Metaxas laments that only the great powers can be truly independent. Well, this can be debated, and that as a historian, I have seen much evidence that even the officials of the great powers themselves do not believe that they are really absolutely independent. Anyway, Metaxas' policy in that tragic summer of 1940, after the fall of France and of continental Western Europe, when the cause of freedom was receiving one blow after the other, it is clear that Metaxas tried and succeeded in maintaining a space of autonomous national action. He tried until the very end to give no pretext to Mussolini to attack. He made it clear to the Germans that Greece, if attacked, would fight to the end, hoping that this way the Germans would avert an Italian invasion. But none of this worked. It fell thus on Metaxas's shoulders the responsibility to say the famous no to the Italian demands on the morning of the 28th of October, 1940. Although one could know this no, this ohi, was not said exactly in this manner. Metaxas's discussion with the Italian ambassador took place in French, and Metaxas's exact phrase when rejecting the ultimatum was alors c'est la guerre, therefore we have war. This phrase was depicted as the famous Greek ohi. Then we Greeks spent many years hotly debating who said that ohi, Metaxas or the Greek people. This was not a very creative discussion, and today historians agree that the ohi was said by Metaxas, if only because he was the only person at that moment who could have said yes, and he did not say it. At the same time, the decision to resist the Italian fascist attack incorporated also a major option of the Greek state, including the political leadership, the intellectuals, and the wider Greek people. I think this is a much more tenable position regarding the major question, who said that ohi? Well, in conclusion, Europe of the interwar period had been divided between the law-abiding and the revisionist forces. This was a conflict that involved the concept of international community, the liberal international order after the First World War, the choice for peace, the rejection of violence. In the 1930s, using unheard of tactics and means, Nazism bullied the Western democracies and destroyed this international order. At the same time, this European West, deeply wounded by the experience of the Great War and of the Great Depression, proved unable to draw its red lines and defend them. In this context, Greece, even tormented by weakness, by internal political passions, bankruptcy, and by the huge need to accommodate the 1922 refugees, chose to side with the forces of legality. The ohi of 28th of October 1940 was said by Metaxas, but it reflected a consensus and a conscious choice of Greek society. It was a choice of worlds. This was recognized by the international observers at that time, and this was why the country became an international symbol. The Greeks of 1940 were not hailed, were not honored internationally only because they proved brave. They were honored as the people who expressed a whole worldview, the one we now call Western civilization. Thank you so much, Mr. President.
Well, thank you, Professor Hadjivasiliou, for that really great presentation today, leading up until, the point in time of when Metaxas either saying then it is war or it is OXI, but it's a synonym, I guess, for no. And I do remind, obviously, everyone who's with us here to please submit any question you might have for our distinguished speaker here today. But let me ask a question here, if I may. Regardless of the failure of the international order, regarding all the elements that brought Greece and Metaxas to that defining moment of October 28th, 1940, he was faced with an ultimatum of which he decided to say that no, and to ultimately put Greece in a position that it was going to fight against this fascism, and no one was going to come in and just walk into Greece without a struggle. But with Mussolini, though, and correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding of the history of the time, Mussolini always felt the inferior to Adolf Hitler, and was always looking for somehow to be an equal to Adolf Hitler, and to do that, he looked at this invasion in that regard. Would you say, is that true as part of the historical narrative?
There's no doubt that Mussolini by 1940 felt inferior to Hitler. This was not their relationship. This was not the crux of their relationship in the start. In the beginning, you see, Mussolini was the old fascist leader. He had held power since 1922, and Hitler seemed to be an admirer. But you see, the difference was, it was a dual difference. First of all, Germany was much more powerful than Italy. And then Hitler was much more radical and revolutionary than Mussolini. So by 1940, yes, it is clear that Italy was becoming slowly but steadily effectively a German satellite. So what he needed was a success to offset Hitler's many successes, victories in the West against France, Belgium, Holland, and the Netherlands. And Mussolini also always had this vision, this scheme of an Italian Mediterranean, a new Mare Nostrum of the Roman period. So he probably felt, there's no doubt that the Italian General Staff underestimated the Greek forces and the Greek determination to resist. On the other hand, let's try to be precise. Okay, it was a war of heroism by the Greeks, but it still was a contemporary war. This meant that it had to be an organized war. And this is where Metaxas and the Greek state proved very effective. I mean, that Greek state, even with those huge weaknesses, proved very good in organizing this war. I mean, Metaxas, understanding that Mussolini might strike, made a partial mobilization of local troops in Epirus in order to strengthen his first lines. And then the chief of the Greek General Staff, General Alexandros Papagos, had made a very effective plan for partial mobilization of the country. So soldiers were coming in waves to the centers for recruitment, and they were being moved by waves to the front. So it was done in a very effective way. It still was an industrial war. And Greece showed a surprisingly high level of readiness to meet its very great demands. But then again, let me remind that the prime minister was Metaxas, arguably one of the best military leaders of his time. I mean, I'm convinced that if Metaxas had been born a subject of a great power, he would be one of the big military leaders in world history. And the chief of the general staff was General Papagos, who won two wars, the Greek-Italian War in 1940 and the Civil War in 1949. So arguably, the two best military leaders of modern Greek history were both present in that war, and this showed. We must not neglect this element of excellent preparation by the Greek state, even its in its state of weakness of that time.
Let me just sort of follow up a little bit. You mentioned, I believe, somewhere in your presentation regarding Metaxas's desire to make Germany know that Greece was not really looking to get involved in any conflict.
Mhm.
And as we all know, obviously, this was during the time of preparations of Hitler and Nazi Germany regarding its Operation Barbarossa, which we can get into a little bit later. So having said that, and can you tell us what ultimately was the Hitler and Nazi Germany's ultimate design in terms of how to deal with Greece before Mussolini invaded in 1940? What was the plan, that they had for Greece? And ultimately, is it possible, can you tell us, can you speak to Hitler got so caught off guard regarding Mussolini's advancement and invasion into Greece that he couldn't have stopped him if he wanted to?
There's no doubt that Germany at that time, before the Italian invasion, did not want any trouble in the Balkans. I mean, for Hitler, the Balkans was not really part of his Lebensraum. And even later, even during the Second World War, it was really Italy that was the prime occupying force in Greece until 1943. It was regarded as an Italian sphere of influence. So Hitler, planning his invasion of the Soviet Union, would prefer to have no trouble in the Balkans. Especially, he could not accept the idea that Greece would be part of the Allied camp, because with the technological capabilities of that day, the British heavy bombers could take off from Greece and hit the Romanian oil fields in Ploesti, which was a huge strategic asset for the Germans. I mean, in both world wars, Germany did not have access to many raw material, and especially oil. Yes, Mussolini tried to and managed to take Hitler by surprise. Metaxas tried to indirectly threaten the Germans that if the Italians attacked, Greece would fight with all its means, and therefore they would have to face a British ally in Southeastern Europe. By doing this, Metaxas hoped that the Germans would stop any aggressive plans of Mussolini. The problem is that Mussolini wanted to surprise him. Yes, he surprised him. They did not have the chance to stop him, although as a historian, I cannot tell you if they would have stopped him anyway. I mean, if they would have decided to stop him. But after the unexpected Greek successful resistance, after the Greek counterattack in Epirus and then moving into South Albania, after mid-November 1940, it is clear that Hitler decided to wipe out this cluster of resistance, which would be very dangerous strategically during his attempt to his invasion of the Soviet Union. And this is exactly when he gives the order to prepare Marita Plan, the plan for the invasion of Greece, which was altered subsequently because of the successful Greek resistance, and forced him to make a big operation in the Balkans, something that he did not want to do initially. I mean, Hitler did not want to divert so many forces in the Balkans in the spring of 1941.
Okay, we do have some questions here from our audience.
Okay.
This comes from Nick Karambulis. He actually has two questions, but I'll ask them more pertinent to the current discussion. This is, again, this is the usual thing we all attribute to regarding Greece's heroic efforts. Do you believe that the fact that Hitler had to invade Greece when he did contribute to the ultimate defeat of Hitler in Russia?
Well, look, it is important to note that Greece continued to fight for 6 months. It was defeating the Italians for 6 months. I mean, after the first advance into Albanian territory in South Albania, northern Epirus, the Greek forces stabilized their line deep into Albania and held it even in the face of the huge Italian spring offensive in March 1941. Now, by March 1941, Hitler was preparing to make an invasion of this. To this end, he had already secured the cooperation of Bulgaria and of Yugoslavia. But in March 1941, when the Italian spring offensive took place and was repulsed by the Greeks, then this strengthened the forces in Yugoslavia who did not want to take part in the war in Germany's favor. And there was this coup late March in Yugoslavia, and Yugoslavia decided to join the side of Greece. This is the element, I think, that forced Hitler to make a much bigger operation in the Balkans than initially he was planning. It was the switch of Yugoslavia, which in turn was caused by the successful Greek defense against the Italian spring offensive. So it is a chain of events that really force Hitler to divert many forces, including mechanized and armored divisions in the Balkans. Now, whether this contributed to the ultimate defeat of Hitler in Russia, many Allied officials have said so, and may I remind that even the Moscow radio made this very impressive broadcast to the Greek people, this famous phrase that we had delayed the invasion of Hitler the invasion of the Soviet Union by Hitler, and that famous phrase, as Russians and as humans, we thank you. That was by Moscow radio. Now, whether this caused the ultimate defeat of Hitler in Russia, this is a bigger, that there was a delay, yes. I think that the ultimate defeat of the revisionist forces of fascism, of fascist totalitarianism, I think, was the entry of the United States into the war. I mean, after that, it was impossible for them to win. I mean, that was the decisive factor. Now, whether the Greeks played a small part by providing the first victory in the land war and by probably delaying the German attack against the Soviet Union, that is a further honor for us. But I think that the decisive moment was December 1941, the entry of the United States. And that decided the war.
Yeah, Pearl Harbor was certainly a seminal moment, but just a quick follow-up.
Not only Pearl Harbor, the fact also that after Pearl Harbor, when the United States had declared war on Japan, Hitler rushed to declare war on the United States.
Yeah, of course.
It was...
Yeah, he went on multiple fronts.
He maximized the number of his adversaries, both the Soviet Union and the United States.
Let me just a quick follow-up, and I want you to tell me what you think Hitler believed. A guy by the name of Carl E. Meyer, an editorial writer for the New York Times, in April 16th of 1994, wrote in a footnote, he said that Hitler believed that the several weeks it took Germany to subdue Greece was responsible for his losing the war against the Soviet Union. Is there any historical documentation of Hitler stating that Hitler believed that?
This is what his generals said, even in Nuremberg. But again, I mean, as a historian, I need to be very careful and to cross-check my evidence. The fact that the German generals say this thing by itself is a very important evidence, but I need, again, to cross-check it very carefully. And I think that it is this chain of events that this is crucial. It's not Greece itself, it's Greece's repulsion of the Italian offensive, spring 1941, which causes the switch of Yugoslavia, and Yugoslavia is a different category from Greece. It's a regional power, and this is what forces Hitler to make this big, much bigger operation than initially he planned.
You mentioned regarding, having to move many divisions and other armaments and manpower and so forth for the Balkans, but that was the case also throughout the following years because of the partisans, in Yugoslavia, and obviously the great resistance that was given in Greece. I forget where I read how many divisions that were deployed by Germany in the Balkans during this time. Could you argue that these divisions, if they were deployed in Normandy in 44, could have been a difference maker in a way?
Look, the quality of the troops that were diverted to attack Yugoslavia and Greece in 1941 was very different from the quality of the divisions that were used for stationary duties later on in the Balkans. I'm not saying that all of them were second-rate. What I'm saying is that all the divisions that were diverted to attack in the Balkans in the spring of 1941 were first-class units, formations, and this is what causes this delay. Let's not forget that it was really a question of days that prevented the Germans from taking Moscow. So, okay, of course, the resistance, the wartime resistance in Greece and in Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia is the largest resistance movement during the Second World War, reaching something like 800,000 armed people, men and women, under Tito. Yes, it was a drain on German resources, no doubt. I'm not really prepared to say that if these troops were in Normandy, they would have made much of a difference. I think that if they were not in the Balkans, they would probably be in the Eastern Front and would be slaughtered with the same ease. This is where the big vacuums existed in the German forces. I mean, Normandy was garrisoned very effectively. It just was a huge operation that and a tactical surprise of the Allies, because they struck at a different point than the Germans were expecting. That made the whole difference.
Okay. All right. It's going back to from one of our guests viewing this presentation. A question from a James Anthony Janos, if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. He asks, could you please discuss Turkey's role more in World War II? Was it officially neutral, but effectively on the side of the Axis powers?
Well, there was, in older periods, there was this very famous book, The Evasive Neutral, discussing Turkey in the Second World War. Look, one must try to understand how Turkey views, or at least that Turkey, the Kemalist Turkey, viewed the world. Turkish policy is a strange mixture of this feeling that it is a big power, the inheritor of the Ottoman Empire, but at the same time, together with this feeling of grandeur, it also feels extremely vulnerable. It has a kind of defensive psychosis, which derives from its experience in the first years of the 20th century and the First World War. Turkey at that time was afraid that in case of a new war, it might face again its experience of the First World War, therefore dismemberment. And this is why Turkey was determined not to be drawn into this war. But this has its roots in Turkish worldviews, in how Turkey understands the world. They feel very powerful. Perhaps it was an illusion of grandeur. I mean, it was not a great power. But at the same time, they feel very vulnerable. And this is a very strange mixture. So what they tried to do was to remain outside. They made an alliance with the British and the French. And when the French collapsed, then they made an alliance with the Germans. And effectively, at least in the first years of the Second World War, they were very good partners of the Germans, but they did not join the Germans. Then they faced Churchill personally went to Turkey to try to convince them to participate in the war, and they said no. But this has its roots in their own, in the Turkish leadership's own insecurities, great insecurities, and they decided to play it this way. They only joined, typically, or formally joined the war in 1945 because at that time you could not become a member of the United Nations if you had not declared war on Germany. So this is why Turkey in the last months of the war in Europe appears on the Allied side. In effect, it did not want to join and remained, I must say, very skillfully. I mean, they decided that they needed this and they managed to do it. Although in this big struggle, this is the most ideological war in contemporary years, they simply remained outside as if it was not something that bothered them. Who would win?
Well, again, though, if my recollection is correct, I recall reading a passage in Albert Speer's book, Inside the Third Reich. As we well know, he was, Hitler's armaments minister, amongst other things. And he says, if I recall, that Turkey was supplying valuable raw material that was essential to the armaments development. And he goes on to say, again, if my mind is clear on this, that he says that for what Turkey provided, it extended the war by another 6 months. Can you speak to the effect in terms of that, in terms of what they were providing Turkey or Germany rather in these various raw materials that were essential to the war effort?
Well, this is very important. You see, Germany was poor in many raw materials which were essential for the war. Even its conquests could not replace these raw materials, could not cover its needs. And this is why, and of course, Germany was facing a continental blockade, which is the traditional way of the British waging war against continental Europe. So they had no other way to secure these materials, but only from neighboring states. Turkey obviously provided some of these materials, and this was the price that it had to pay in order to be left outside of the war. This is how the Turks saw it. We must try to understand also how the Turks saw it. Now, if this extended the war by 6 months or by more or by less, I must say I cannot tell. But there's no doubt that Turkey played this role of feeding the German war machine.
Well, I submit that that Turkish policy continues to this day in various forms in the Eastern Mediterranean. Look, we're almost nearing the end of our webinar here today. Let me just ask one last question here. As heroic a stance as this was, as historic as it was, the famous quotes by Roosevelt, the famous quote by Churchill, by German generals, and so many others.
And let me just repeat the quote by Moscow radio about delaying the attack and not giving enough time to the Germans to take Moscow. I mean, as Russians and as humans, we thank you. I mean, this is a big statement.
Without a doubt, including the blaring headlines of the New York Times, following the resistance of OXI and what the Greeks were doing. So why, Professor, to this day, and this is a pet peeve of mine, why, and Greece was on the side of the victors, and usually history is written always by the victors. Why doesn't Greece get its fair shake in terms of its contributions in World War II? Why do we have at least 3 movies on Dunkirk made in Hollywood, which is a total failure by the Brits, and so many others? And yet, in Western history books, you just don't see even a byline of Greece's contributions in World War II, or even a mention of OXI.
Well, this is a very painful question, Mr. President, because it's so to the point. Well, first of all, Greece did not get its fair share after the Second World War because of its civil war, because it faced a huge internal crisis, which made it much more weak, much weaker than it should be to put forward claims. In fact, during the peace conference with Italy and with Bulgaria in Paris, 1947, I mean, just imagine at that time, the Greeks were begging the Americans to come and rescue them from another danger. That was the time of the Truman Doctrine, of the Marshall Plan. So one major reason why Greece was not, let me put it a bit crudely, rewarded for this contribution, was Greece's fault, the fault of the Greeks. And this huge problem of disunity and discord that really destroyed the Greek diplomatic effort. I mean, how convincing could the Greek claim be at a time when the Greek governments were seeking support and material from the United States, and the communist insurgents were asking for material from their own allied states and the Soviet satellites. Now, regarding memory and popular perceptions, this is much more painful because in the end of the day, we had a civil war. We could not get the rewards, in quotation marks, that we should back then, but that was over. Whereas our absence from international debates through film, for example, today, well, it's our fault now. It's the fault that our generation is doing. I'm afraid that there is no presentable, in fact, there's no depiction of that very important war by the Greeks for many decades now. I mean, now we have this anniversary, and I'm sure that the Greek television will show again those very old films shot in the early 1970s during the junta, which are not even very good. I mean, not many of them at least, and most of them at least, are not very good. Anyway, they belong to a different period. And then 50-something years later, we have failed to do this, even to do a good film about that golden hour of ours. At the time when we were being hailed as the heroes of the cause of freedom. And this is our failure. This is our fault. We should not be hesitant or ashamed to discuss such a big victory, such a big moment, which represents not only our own national sentiment or national glory, if you like, it represents a major moment of the Western civilization. And if we don't do it, this is our fault.
Well, on that last point, that's a major discussion for another day, but I do agree with you to an extent. But I still can't absolve the responsibility, notwithstanding Greece's involvement in a bitter civil war after World War II, of the historians who have written on the factual aspects of World War II. They still could have written on the historical truths regarding the contributions of Greece in World War II, notwithstanding, still, in my opinion, that they were, involved in a civil war. So,
okay, do you mean Greek historians or international historians?
International historians who have written on the history of World War II. I mean, you just don't see it. Again, you're a historian.
The fight of a small country, you see, usually is not regarded very easily as a determining factor in a world war. On the other hand, let me just say that there are relatively very few historical books, even by Greek historians, on 1940 to 41.
Well, that's interesting too, and that's a shame, frankly, regarding from the Greek perspective. But be it as it may, here we at the American Hellenic Institute, we always want to pay tribute to this great resistance, this great victory, this first victory of World War II, and we do celebrate every year with at least on a minimum basis a presentation of this nature. And just for your information, Professor, and to those who are still listening. Over the years, AHI has provided a lot of resources towards this topic, where we had a major conference a number of years ago, a 2-day conference in which we published the proceedings specifically on Greece's contributions in World War II. And we also had one on the Truman Doctrine also, and another opus written by one of our members called The First Victory, where he highlighted in great detail Greece's resistance and victory. And before I thank you, Professor, I'd like to read, as I always do every year, in finishing off this presentation, from one of our that particular conference, and one of the people who contributed to that conference, a quote, and he said, "As the years pass, it becomes more and more necessary to recall and record for generations just how the people of Greece, alone or with allies, gained and held for their country for a century and more the independence and democracy it possesses today, and how in one special moment in history, Greece, at a heavy cost and sacrifice, and with great courage and determination, played a pivotal role in World War II in defying the forces of tyranny and Axis aggression. They were arrayed against not only Greece, but the whole of Western civilization. It is an inspiring story." And the author of this quote is late General Andrew J. Goodpaster, United States Army, former Supreme Commander of NATO. So, Professor, it was a great pleasure. This was a really enlightening presentation today on some elements that I, and I'm sure many of our audience, were not aware of leading up until, obviously, 1940. We thank you once again. We hope to call you again in the future on some other subject matters that we here try to present at the American Hellenic Institute. I also want to thank my staff, Zach Kodronakis, our executive director, and Alexander Christopher, our legislative assistant, who helped and assisted in today's production. And of course, as always, I'd like to thank our sponsor, James H. Legos Company of Springfield, Ohio, for helping us to bring these virtual speakers forums to our audience. Thank you again, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Professor.
May I thank you? It was a pleasure and an honor, a big honor, Mr. President. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to take part in this event.
No, it was my pleasure. And as OXI is a few days away, Zito to OXI and Zito Eleftheria. Thank you once again, and have a wonderful evening in Greece, which I forgot to mention. Professor Hadjivasiliou, for those still on, is live in Athens, 7 hours ahead, which for him is 9 o'clock in the evening. So we certainly thank you for being with us here today once again. And we thank all our audience, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, thank you.
Take care. Take care.